Australia, what is going on here? If you aren't a high earner and you're living in one of the big cities, you're basically stuffed. If you're in the middle class and don't own your own home, you're stuffed. If you're retired and don't own a home, you are also stuffed. And if you're a high earner, yes, of course you are better off than most people, but then you have to be comfortable with getting slugged 47 cents in the dollar taxation. That is enough to make a lot of people think, hang on, there has to be a better way. As one of our clients told us, he basically feels that he is in an abusive relationship with the government. And if you're in a bad relationship, be it a personal relationship or a business relationship, you're generally going to look for better options. There is nothing wrong with wanting the best for yourself and your family, regardless of whether you're a high earner earning, several $100,000 a year, or if you're living on the pension. Australia isn't particularly a great place for anyone at the moment. The sad fact of it is, no matter where you are on the spectrum of low income through to high income in Australia, one way or another you are getting stung, either by high taxation or by high inflation and not being able to afford anything. Now, Australia has been relatively expensive for quite a long time, but in recent years it has got a lot worse, as anyone who lives here can tell you, or anyone who has visited here will be able to tell you that as well. It is just so expensive to do anything, to buy food, to go out to dinner, to have some kind of entertainment, to just enjoy your life. Everything costs so much money. As soon as you step out of the door, you are paying for it. Even when you don't step out the door and you choose to stay home, you are still having a very hard time at it, particularly if you rent, because rent is just so high. In our business, we talk to a lot of people who are simply struggling and cannot afford to live in Australia, or people who are just feel they're not getting a good deal here and want to go elsewhere. We also talk to a lot of people who are just sick and tired of being regulated within an inch of their lives. In Australia, there is rules for absolutely everything. We'd have to be one of the most regulated countries on the planet. There is just so much gum in the system, it's really hard to get things done now. If you're in business, if you want to hire staff, if you want to build a house or do a development of some kind, it doesn't really matter what you want to do. If you want to do anything that is generally productive for the economy, that would normally stimulate the economy, create jobs, there is just so much regulation, so much red tape, green tape, every kind of tape under the sun that makes it very difficult to do anything, and it also pushes the price up of doing everything. Housing is a major problem in Australia. There is a huge housing shortage and rents are going through the roof. Most people who are just on sort of middle to low income are struggling to pay their rent. And while at the same time that we have these historically low vacancy rates, there's just so hard to find available rentals, immigration is at all-time highs, which is just exacerbating the problem. There's more and more people coming into the country and just nowhere to put them. It really is no wonder that some people are looking for the exits, but not everyone has that luxury of being able to leave. We try not to get too much into politics on this channel, but the Labor government in Australia basically is run by the unions. And while unions seem to have a good intention on the face of it, it often ends up just pushing up the costs of everything. If you saw what union workers were earning on some of these big public infrastructure projects, you would probably fall off your chair. There is so much money being made by union affiliated people and going into the unions themselves. They in turn pump a lot of money into the political parties, predominantly the Labor Party, and it just keeps going round and round. The unions and the politicians become more powerful and the system just becomes more entrenched. The Conservative Party, they don't get off scot-free either. They were pretty much responsible for the inflation that we're experiencing right now. A lot of the inflation problem, not all of it, but a lot of it was started with all the money that just flowed from everywhere. It was raining cash for a long time in Australia. A lot of debt was taken on, public spending. This just pushed on inflation. So both political parties have contributed to making Australia what it is. There's no doubt about that. It's a bipartisan effort. At the moment, public spending as a proportion of GDP, our gross domestic product, the income of the country, is at, I think, all-time high levels. It is certainly very, very high. This is due to government spending and a bloated public service. Having the government be such a large part of a country's GDP is not good if you want a good, healthy, balanced economy, a free market economy. All it does is distort things, it crowds out the private sector. People who would be more productive in the private sector are being enticed into the public sector where productivity is very low. Having such a large proportion of our economy dependent on the public purse is not good for productivity and the general future and well-being of our country and our economy. Also, I might add that having such a large proportion of the economy being related to the public service and government spending is sort of how socialism begins. More welfare, higher taxes, bigger public service, these things just feed on each other. So my read on it is things aren't great, but I think it's going to get a lot worse. I think that taxes are going to go up. I think that cost of living is just going to get harder. I think that I think it's going to be harder to go out and make money for yourself without being reliant on the government in some way. Energy policy is another thing. I don't want to talk too much about that here, but having a massive renewable energy transition, having to put in all this new infrastructure, it's very expensive as well. This is just one more thing that will contribute to making it very hard to do business in Australia. It's going to be very hard for manufacturing to stay competitive when energy prices are so high and labour costs are so high. A lot of our manufacturing will go elsewhere, probably up to Asia, places like Vietnam and Indonesia and so on. So all of this stuff, all of this societal cost, it has to be paid for. And usually the way that these things are paid for are in higher inflation, a lower standard of living, and higher taxes. And then on the back end of this, the government is trying to implement a new policy around residency rules that is going to make it harder to leave the country. I don't necessarily think that bringing in new rules for residency, a bright line test as they call it, is a bad thing. The current rules are a bit vague, but if they're going to make it harder for people to leave the country to exit the Australian tax system, that is something that is not really desirable either. So what do? You stay there, you stick it out. Not everyone has the opportunity to leave. You might have family ties, you might have work commitments, you might not have a kind of job that allows you to pick up and leave. But for people who are a bit more mobile, there are plenty of options, and that's what we're all about. This is why we base ourselves up in Asia, and we help other people to do the same thing. So if you're able to work remotely, you can leave. If you're able to run your business online or have run the admin and call the shots from overseas while you have some staff back in Australia doing the day-to-day on-the-ground things, you can leave as well. If you have investments that you can live off while living overseas, you can leave. And if you are retired and living on a pension, you can take that pension with you and go live overseas, and that small amount of money you make every fortnight will go a lot further. Moving overseas isn't for everyone, but you have to ask yourself as well, if you are struggling, why subject yourself to such a miserable existence here in Australia? If you're just sitting at home every night because you can't afford to go out and you're eating baked beans and fish fingers because you can't afford to eat steak, is that really a good way to live? Particularly if you're retired and you might only have 10 or 20 or 30 years left to live. Why would you want to subject yourself to such a miserable existence for the last part of your life? This is supposed to be the most enjoyable part of your life. That's what we're told when we work for 50 years in a career that we can retire and then do all the things we want to do. But then you realize that you're living on a pension and you can't afford to do squat. We are so lucky in Australia that we do have viable alternatives just a short distance to the north. Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, all of these places and more, you can live a much higher quality of life on the same amount of money, and you can always be back home in Australia in a number of hours. The time zones are very convenient as well, but not just for Australians. There are a lot of people from all over the world, a lot of Americans, a lot of Europeans we talk to who are moving out to Southeast Asia. We even talk to people from East Asia, from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, who are moving to Southeast Asia just because the quality of life for the money can be so much higher. So this is part of what we do, guys. If you're interested in getting an exit plan out of Australia, that is looking around your residency, looking at the tax implications of leaving the country. If you want help with any of that stuff, we can help you to do that. And on the other side, when you arrive in the country that you're going to, what visa do you want? How are you going to structure your investments, your business? Is it going to affect your pension? We can help you with all of these things and more. Head over to offshoreinasia.com. We've got a bunch of articles up there where you can learn all different kinds of things about living in Asia. You can also send us an email, or you can book in a consult call if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty and start planning out your future life.